Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, AVOWED. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. Thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode as we dive into the history, game mechanics, and lore for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Obsidian Entertainment's release, AVOWED. For those wondering why we pair Pillars of Eternity with AVOWED, it's because they share the same fantasy world known as Eora. And so as the theory goes, if we look into Pillars of Eternity, we can make some insights towards AVOWED as it undergoes development. I want to extend my thanks to people who offered their congratulations or their sympathies to me, depending on how you determine it, on the new news that has happened. For those who aren't aware, I recently posted on Twitter last time when an episode was supposed to be out that there was no episode coming out. And that is because my wife and I were blessed by the goddess Hylia. That's got to be the nerdiest thing I've ever said. But long story short, we had our first child at the very end of February, and I had one episode in the cartridge ready to go, so I had that for you mid-March, but I was just far too busy and tired to be able to make a second episode, so that's why we didn't have anything 2 weeks ago, but here we are today. With the podcast moving forward and me learning how to be a new dad, there may or may not be some changes. I don't know what's going to happen, but I want to let you guys know ahead of time that, there might be some things go on. I'm considering having the episodes be a lot shorter, but perhaps I can release them weekly if they're easy enough to put out. I don't really know what I'm going to do with it, but I definitely want to keep the podcast going. I want to continue talking about the lore that's in this world, especially as AVOWED gets closer and closer. But I also need to have a healthy kind of personal life balance with all this stuff, so we'll just figure this out as it goes. There's no news regarding any of the games that I think we need to go over, so today we're just going to dive straight into the lore, and we're going to be talking about dragons today.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So I feel like this episode is a long time coming. I mean, we're talking about the lore for a fantasy world that we see in a video game. And we're like, what do you think of when you have fantasy worlds? You got magic, you've got elves and dwarves, you've got dungeons, and then of course you've got dragons. And we haven't even talked about dragons yet. So that's what I want to talk about today, specifically what dragons are in the world of Eora versus maybe what we see in other fantasy settings. For those of you who have got a lot of experience in epic fantasy games, dragons are going to be something that you're quite familiar with. We see them everywhere, to the point that they exist in mythologies and lore and stories for stuff that isn't even fantasy. They exist in medieval folktales and whatnot. Dragons are one of the key things I think we see specifically in fantasy games, and Eora is no different. The people over at Obsidian, when creating this world, they included dragons in it. And I will say that I think that they make dragons seem a lot more mundane than they do in other fantasy settings. And I don't mean that in a negative sense that dragons are boring or they are not powerful in any way, but that dragons in the world of Eora, they're a little more down to earth, I guess you could say, not in the sense of a personality, but like they have a little bit more grounded reason for their existence and how they age and mature into the creatures that we see in Eora, versus in a lot of other fantasy settings, dragons tend to be these very mysterious creatures that can sometimes exist from out of nowhere, and they seemingly have this ancient knowledge that nobody else has and this magic power that no one else has access to or something like that. You think of dragons from Skyrim that had their own society, and they were kind of the dominant race at one point in Tamriel's history. This isn't a lore podcast for Skyrim, so if I'm getting anything wrong, whatever, that doesn't matter. But, point being, like, their dragons exist in all forms of fantasy settings, and they can range anywhere from being utterly fantastical and magical and almost paradoxical to being just regular creatures that are mindless. There are dragons in other fantasy settings that are just beasts. They don't have a hyper intelligence. They don't have any magical powers. They're just these flying dragon lizards that breathe fire and are very territorial, right? And I think Eora walks a nice middle line with what dragons are. So first off, going from the Pillars of Eternity of Fandom website, this is the description that we have for dragons. A dragon is both the name for the creature and the short title for the mature stage of its life cycle. During their enormously long life cycle of hundreds, if not thousands of years, dragons go through 3 stages of growth before reaching their final adult form. So they start off as an egg, they go into the worm stage, next into the drake, and then finally they mature fully into a dragon. And so we're going to talk about worms, drakes, and dragons, and that's the kind of the growing, the maturing process until a creature becomes a fully mature adult dragon. If we move into the strategy guide for Pillars of Eternity 1, this is the official description written for a dragon, is that a full-grown dragon is colossal, taller than most buildings of Kith construction when at rest, and they can easily rise to twice that height when rearing up on their hind legs. Dragons have reached the mature stage of their life cycle. Like drakes, they have adapted to fit into their environment, but are even more extensively. Their coloration, ornamentation, even body structure will reflect their chosen territory, as will the attack and defenses they bring to bear. So what that basically means is as a dragon settles into an area that it's claiming as its territory, when it goes from the worm stage into the drake stage, as it's maturing, as it ages, it will take on the environment around it. We've seen this in some other creatures within Eora, but this is especially noticeable with dragons, especially when you interact with a fully matured dragon. For instance, if you run into the Adra dragon, which lives at near a large deposit of Adra, we'll say for now, it is a dragon that looks like it is made out of Adra. So when dragons are aging, their bodies actually start to mimic the environment around them, and it gives them unique traits and abilities that they bring towards combat, because of course, people love to kill dragons in fantasy games, right? So that's what we're going to do. Because they have already claimed territory and rarely face a threat from other dragons or drakes, they are more conservative in nature and will not seek unnecessary conflict. Only dragons can mate. This is generally the only occasion that causes a dragon to leave its lands or seek out others of its kind. Upon reaching the dragon stage, these creatures assume a gender. However, if surrounding populations are too heavily skewed one way or another, individual dragons can change their sex. As creatures that reach this stage are so rare, this ability is critical to the survival of the species. So this is an interesting little bit that they decided to include for the lore of dragons, is that only dragons can mate. So when they're in their worm and drake stages, they can't mate, they can't procreate. They have to have these creatures fully mature to a dragon state in order to propagate their species. But as an interesting trait of their evolution, I suppose, they are able to actually switch genders, so that if there are too many of one gender in the immediate areas for mating purposes, then a dragon can change their sexes in order to mate with dragons nearby. And this is, as it says here, critical for the survival of their species. Dragons are more intelligent than most other sentient beings, but their solitary nature prevents them from interacting meaningfully with other species. Like in a lot of fantasy settings, dragons in Eora have a hyper intellect. They are very intelligent. You're able to engage in discourse with them and have discussions with them and convince them of stuff, if you have a high enough statistic for it. So they are creatures that you can actually talk to, unlike worms, which I don't think I've ever had an interaction with a worm in a game where I was able to actually have some sort of meaningful discussion with them. So worm in the World of Eora is spelled W-U-R-M. It's not like the little earthworm in the dirt. For those not familiar with dragon nomenclature, it's W-U-R-M, and that's just an early stage of the dragon's maturity. Now, getting into the different stages of a dragon, let's first start off with an egg. Now, there's not much to say about a dragon egg. Essentially, two dragons mate, there's an egg, and it just incubates until the dragon comes out. When the dragon comes out of the egg, it moves into the younger dragon maturity, which is called the worm stage, W-U-R-M. Young dragons begin their life cycle as worms, though most never develop beyond that stage. Worms are clever and sly, if not especially intelligent. To develop into a drake, and eventually a dragon, a worm must have ample space and resources. They will not develop if they live near existing drakes and dragons. They must seek out a habitat that has not already been claimed by a larger counterpart. Since the chances of further development are low, most worms will band together in covens for survival. They are bold and highly aggressive creatures. The intense competition for food and territory demands this. So we're really getting an idea here with worms that survival for dragons or for this type of creature is really low, whether it be because there's not enough food nearby to go around, or local competition is going to take you down, or perhaps you're even being hunted by people. This, in a lot of fantasy settings, dragons are one of those pinnacle creatures to hunt, or they're a creature that cannot be ever taken down. But in Eora, there are actually bands of hunters that do get together specifically to hunt dragons, and we see skulls of dragons mounted on walls of these hunting lodges, so we know that they can be taken down. Whether or not they're actually worm skulls, drake skulls, or dragon skulls, I guess are up for debate. But it's really unlikely for a worm to progress past this stage and grow into a fully developed drake. Moving into a drake, which is the next stage, drakes represent the middle stage of a dragon's life cycle. They have developed from worms, but have not reached and may never reach the dragon stage. Drakes aggressively defend their territory and seek to expand it as much as possible. They are actively hostile against other drakes who represent competition for scarce resources. Their coloration reflects the territory they have claimed. A drake living in a swamp, for instance, may be shades of green, brown, and black and possess nictitating membranes, a flat snout, and raised nostrils. While all drakes can breathe fire, many also develop alternate breath attacks incorporating other elements. So it's at this drake stage where we really start to see the dragon-esque qualities of these beasts. They start to stop working together, whereas the worms are trying to work together in little covens to try to survive because it's the only thing they can do. They need to work together to survive. Once they start reaching this drake stage, they get a little bit more independent, and they realize that they're stronger than the rest, and they start to claim territory and food for themselves. But as a result, other drakes that, they're reaching the same maturity, they're also going to vie for these same resources. So there tends to be a lot of competition between drakes. And this is also the stage where we start to see that they are mimicking the environment around them. And so this is where they're kind of like young dragons at this point in time, right? Like they're like little mini dragons. And so that's the intermediate stage for drakes before you reach the fully developed dragon. Now, despite the fact that dragons are in fact rare in Eora, you're very unlikely to run into one or talk to one or survive an encounter with one, they are present enough to see signs of dragons throughout the world of Eora. And if you go into the Pillars of Eternity 2 guidebook, there is a section under the creatures and beasts sections where it talks about dragons. And dragons are split into two categories in the Deadfire Archipelago. Deadfire Archipelago, for those who haven't played the games, is a spattering of islands out in the eastern southern quadrant of the world. It's a very tropical climate kind of thing. And there are actually dragons common enough around there that they have designations for dragons out there. There are magma dragons, and then there are sea dragons. There's enough of them out there that they have categories rather than just naming them. That being said, they are not everywhere. They are not very common, but they are common enough to have separate categories. Magma dragons, as you would imagine, are most commonly found in isolated areas boasting active volcanoes, as they would otherwise be hunted for trophies in the early and middle stages of their maturity. Left to their own devices, clusters of drakes will vie for dominance over habitats in high demand, naturally culling the weak and leaving only the strongest and most intimidating examples of their species to thrive. Suitable nests are therefore hotspots of conflict and competition, and magma dragons are fiercely territorial by necessity. Their scales radiate heat and wisps of smoke. As they move, the orientation of their plates seem to shift in the pattern of flowing lava. And so that's a description for the magma dragon from the Pillars of Eternity 2 guidebook. Moving over to the sea dragon, these dragons tend to live more underwater. Not exclusively, mind you. I'll just read you the description for them here, and it'll tell you themselves. Contrary to popular belief, sea dragons don't spend their entire lives underwater. Before reaching their full maturity, sea dragons will roost in seaside caves or rocky outcroppings with access to their native waters. From these private and easily defended structures, dragons can feed or rest with minimal concern for their safety. These accomplished swimmers dive under the waves to hunt, either picking off aquatic prey or using the water as staging ground to ambush fishing boats, and the graduating only to military or mercenary vessels when their size allows for it. But they don't tarry in the sea for long, or they risk attracting predators of the deep. As they grow older, more confident, sea dragons will test their limitations by spending more of their time underwater, carving out a broad territory by challenging the most intimidating leviathans they encounter, and arranging the remains of defeated foes to decorate the sea floor. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that an elder sea dragon carved out secondary dens in the lightless depths, but such activity has never been conclusively documented. So right there we have two examples of different dragons that are seen within the Deadfire Archipelago. I personally like the description for the sea dragon, and I like the idea that there are these giant leviathans under the water that are, in a sense, more colossal than a dragon. They're almost more formidable of an enemy, because we tend to think of dragons as, like I said, one of these pinnacle creatures to come up against. But in the world of Eora, there are a lot of things that are mysterious that we don't know about. There are monsters out there that dwarf a dragon in a lot of senses, and I like that part of it. Now, for those who are familiar with dragons from other fantasy settings, such as anything Dungeons & Dragons related, you'll know that dragons tend to amass quite a following. If you play Dungeons & Dragons, you'll be familiar with, I believe, kobolds, which look at dragons as their masters or their gods even, and that trope is actually consistent in the world of Eora as well. In the world of Eora, dragons, as they are aging from worm into drake, they become very powerful. They start to attract the attention of these small creatures known as Xaurips, Xaurips. They are a very common kind of cannon fodder enemy that you run into a lot playing Pillars of Eternity games. And I expect we'll run into a lot of them in AVOWED. No matter where the game is set, you're probably going to find Xaurips there. So it's very likely. But the nice thing is, with Xaurips being present almost everywhere, that could also indicate the likelihood of there being dragons, which means when we go to play AVOWED, we might be running into dragons. I really hope so. I feel like the game of AVOWED would be a little bit empty, not totally empty, but a little bit empty if there wasn't at least one dragon for us to have a substantial interaction with. Xaurips will tend to form tribes around drakes before they are dragons, and they will serve them as if the drake is their god and their master. And quite often, these societies of creatures of Xaurips, they will perform ritual sacrifices where the groups of them will go to the drake and sacrifice their bodies as food for the drake so that it continues to grow and become more powerful. And this, in a sense, makes their tribe more strong and more renowned because their god is getting bigger and more stronger, right? So it's just an interesting little kind of cultural aspect, I guess, to dragons, drakes, and Xaurips. So you expect to run into Xaurips a lot. Hopefully that indicates that there's a dragon in AVOWED. As I've mentioned, dragons are not impossible to kill. In fact, there is a group of people known as the Society of the Talon, who are a group of hunters that got together to start taking on the biggest and baddest creatures that they could find. And as they were getting bored slaying these beasts in the woods and whatnot, they eventually decided to start taking on drakes and even dragons. They hide a lot of dragon lore for themselves so they can puff up their reputation to people. But nonetheless, this society does exist with the idea that they do hunt down dragons. And you can see remnants of dragons and drakes out in the world of Eora that have either been killed or have died. For example, if you are in one of the intermediary sections of Pillars of Eternity going through the map, there's this entire plane where you see charred remains of dragons that were killed there. If you are in Old Song over in the Twin Elms area from Pillars of Eternity 1, one of the main areas that you go to, Galawain's Maw, you enter in through a dragon's skull. When you're at Anslog's Compass, I believe you can see a drake's skull embedded in the sand. Right, so there are remains of drakes and dragons all over the place. So they are commonplace enough and able to be killed and eventually do die, but despite the fact that they live hundreds, if not thousands of years. One example of a drake being bested by people in Eora would be this dragon outside of Gilded Vale. So specifically, if you have this medium armor called Herbal's Protective Skin, you can read in the item description that in the young village of Gilded Vale, which is one of the main areas that you go to in the game, it was beset by a particularly territorial fire dragon. So in the early days of Gilded Vale being a village, there was this fire dragon that was exerting its territorial dominance in the area. And there was this man named Herbal, Hirbel. He was a master armorsmith of House Radric who had set up the town there, and he forged this armor from the beast's scales after slaying it. So apparently this one guy, and I suppose a group of soldiers, it says here a dozen of the finest soldiers, slew the dragon. So it is possible for you, just a group of humans, to take down a dragon. In fact, some people can be known as dragon hunters. By reading the item description for another unique piece of medium armor known as Wormwool, it reads as follows. A dragon hunter in Rhaetceris commissioned this armor, Wormwool, to protect himself from slashing claws and fiery breath. He enjoyed a long and successful career until he chanced upon a lake dragon and was pulled into the water, drowning in his heavy mail. Unfortunately, he was prepared for the one type of dragon, but not another. But there are people out there who have reputations as dragon hunters. Unless all of them are lying, it is possible for even a single person with enough ingenuity to take down a dragon on their own. And you, of course, as a player in Pillars of Eternity and hopefully Avowed, have the chance to actually take down a dragon as well, if you're up for the task. Throughout your journeys in Eora, there are a lot of dragons that you will run into. Through Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, there are several dragons that you can interact with and have discussions with, or take down in combat, or work with, or work against. For instance, in Pillars of Eternity 1, you run into a dragon that is known as the Sky Dragon. Then in the DLC for Pillars of Eternity, you can run into the Alpine Dragon, as well as the Adra Dragon, which exists in Pillars of Eternity 1 as well. But a lot of these dragons, because they are so hyper-intelligent, they also do have names. For example, the Adra Dragon is known as Sephyra, Sefyra. There are other dragons that we see from Pillars of Eternity that also have names. For example, in the White March DLC Part 2, you can run into a bog dragon known as, let's hope I can pronounce this right, Turris Sulfus, I believe, along with closely Gaphanerkos. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. These are two dragons that are students of a archmage known as Lengrith. And you run into these two dragons at Morgwick and in the Phylactery's Promise quest. So if you have the DLCs for Pillars of Eternity 1, you might run into these two dragons that are partnered together. And in Pillars of Eternity 2, you can encounter a dragon, Skyorielaphas? Scyorielaphas. Skyorielaphas. I cannot remember how to pronounce that name. This is a sea dragon, which is actually been captured, and so you have a chance to work with or against this dragon. There's also the dragon Jadaferlas, or Jadaferlas, Jadeferlas, that you run into through the course of the main story of the game. And if you have the DLC for Pillars of Eternity 2, you run into a kind of undead dragon pretty much right away in the game. It's kind of annoying, actually, for that DLC, but that's a Neriscyrlas, Neriscyrlas. I think it's a rule in Eora that all dragon names have to be impronounceable when you're reading them on paper, but if you hear it said out loud, you're like, oh yeah, I know how to pronounce that. You'll run into that dragon really early on in the Beast of Winter DLC, and he actually becomes kind of one of the main characters of that DLC in a particular way. You'll understand if you play through that DLC. These are all dragons that you can run into. We have sea dragons, bog dragons, these kind of undead winter dragons, if you will, fire dragons as well. So dragons are prevalent in the Eoran games, but they're not common. And every time you interact with a dragon, it is a meaningful encounter. And my hope is that for Avowed, we'll have the same things, that we'll be able to encounter dragons, more than one, hopefully, but that it will not be a common thing. I understand that worms and drakes will be enemies that we can go up against and take down, and they might be a little more common, but these large dragons themselves, I really hope for like long quest lines and ways to align or misalign with these dragons and their agendas, which is usually just about surviving and propagating, like any other beast that exists. And at the end of the day, these dragons are just bestial creatures. They are just mundane creatures. All right. And my wife and I just put our son to bed, so that's going to be it for the episode. And coincidentally, I also had nothing else to say about dragons. Thank you guys for joining me on today's episode. If you have any comments, questions, criticisms, etc., or you just want to start a conversation, you can reach me via email at worldofeora@gmail.com, or you can reach me on Twitter at worldofeora. I really love to have conversations about this stuff and also be pointed out where I may or may not have got some things wrong, or just to chat with people. So if you'd like to reach me on either of those, that would be great. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on today's episode. I will see you guys next time.